Good morning, everybody. We're having a service Sunday here at the Feast Church. And so if you're online with us, you are getting this content, share a little thought with you as you take communion today. Our members here at the building are out in the neighborhood doing a little cleanup, helping do some spring cleaning and get our neighborhood ready for a nice summer outdoors as the weather is starting to turn. I want to start today with one of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld. There is a moment in this episode where Jerry and Elaine are going to get a rental car. And as they're getting the rental car, the main joke is that Jerry has reserved a rental car and yet the car is not available. And he says, you know how to take a reservation, but you know how to keep a reservation. And there's a lot of jokes around the way rental cars work. But then at the end, he says something else interesting, which is that they're about to get the rental car, and she asks, would you like any insurance on the car? And Jerry says, yes, please, because I'm going to beat the hell out of this thing. And there's this idea that he's frustrated, and so he's going to get the insurance because it's just a rental car, and he's going to mistreat it and abuse it. And it's sort of him getting rid of his anger, but it also expresses the way a lot of people feel when they borrow something or they rent something, particularly from a company. We see this with the rental cars. Maybe you've had an apartment where you had rules about what you were able to put in the walls or not, and you ended up breaking those rules and hoping that you could just spackle over all the holes and still get your safety deposit back. The other place I see it a lot is in high schools, where a high school student might receive an instrument. Our kids were talking the other day about how the band instruments at the school are smelly and gross and beat to snot because the different kids have used them over the years and they don't keep them particularly well. Another thing is high school lockers. You give one to a new kid every year, a new kid every 4 years, and then after 4 or 5 decades, those lockers have seen some things because people take the things that they borrow and they don't treat them particularly well. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the environment and about the way Christians think about the environment. We're doing a neighborhood cleanup today, in part because April is the home for Earth Day, and we spend a lot of time this part of year as we get ready to restart our gardens or clean up our lawns or clean the streets, thinking about taking care of the planet we live on. And I know as a kid in church, when I grew up, environmentalism was still a bit of sort of a niche idea. It had not become like a main central space for culture war like it had today. But even as a kid, I had seen sort of this growing sentiment in church that the world was God's and that God was going to burn it all up when we're done with it anyways. And so nobody ever said this, but basically, let's use it like a rental car, or let's treat it like our high school locker. It doesn't belong to us. It's going to get destroyed in the end anyway. So who cares if we beat the snot out of it? Who cares if it gets messed up? It's here for our use and disposal. And so there's the idea that we shouldn't care about the environment as Christians, that environmentalism isn't that important, that caring about carbon emissions or trash or plastics or whatever is not something we need to do. And this morning, I want to kind of think about that and kind of play with a couple of scriptures, look at some scriptures that encourage us to think maybe through that a little bit differently. They're not scriptures you probably read too often, but they both do some interesting things that are similar. The first is going to be Leviticus 18. You may know this passage well because it's actually a passage that's very much about sexual ethics and telling the Israelite people the sorts of relationships they should or should not engage in. And then at the end of this, the writer in Leviticus says this. This is Leviticus 18:24. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sins, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things. For all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out of it, out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. All right, and then another passage here, Hosea chapter 4. Oh, here we go. Hosea 4, verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There's only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bonds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish of the sea are swept away. These passages are interesting because they are passages that take moral failures. In the first example, most explicitly sexual ethics, but then in the second example, bloodshed, murder, violence, stealing, those kinds of things. And it connects moral sin and moral failure with environmental collapse. And it suggests in the first example that the land is almost like an entity, like a person, and that the land is offended by moral failure, and that the land will vomit them out. I find this interesting because we see, I think, sort of three things that interact in these passages and in other places in the Hebrew Bible in a fascinating way. We see where the political entities, the government, the king, and their lack of justice is connected to personal moral failure on the people's part, and that is connected to environmental collapse and destruction. And that those things go together. There is a logic to the Hebrew thinkers that when you have bloodshed and injustice in your land, then the birds and the fish and the animals are going to suffer. And sometimes our modern brains don't like that. We want to process and understand, well, what is it? Does sin have a biological component? Is there some kind of pathogen that sin lets out? And I don't think that's exactly what's going on there. But the Bible is saying that these things are connected. As we've talked many times in these sort of sessions, there is a holistic nature to existence in the Bible, that things affect one another, and that these things connect to each other, that when we have moral failure, it leads to geopolitical issues, and that also leads to environmental issues, and they all bounce off each other in a complex and important way. And if you've read the creation story, this should not surprise you. As we've talked many times, the grounding of the whole Hebrew Bible, what undergirds the story of the Hebrew Bible and thus of the New Testament, is this story of creation. That God didn't take nothing and made something, more that God took chaos and brought order. And that the purpose of creation, the purposes of God in our world, are to create an inhabitable environment for us to live in. And that all this stuff goes together. One way I would think about it is, imagine you are an ancient Hebrew farmer and you are trying to just live out your days in peace and relative ability to get along. And when you're doing that, you want stability in your world. You need environmental stability. You need to avoid earthquakes and big storms and landslides and all that kind of stuff. You need the earth to participate, for the sun to come out and the rain to come down. You need the environment to provide stability for you. But you also need the king to provide stability for you. You can't have him coming in and annexing your land, or drafting your sons off to military duty, or getting involved in battles that are going to lead to your farm being pillaged and plundered by a neighboring nation. You need geopolitical stability to live your life. But then you also need interpersonal stability. You need to know that your neighbor is not going to be in a fight with you because you moved a boundary stone and tried to steal some of his land, or that you nabbed one of his sheep, or you slept with his wife. Like, these are all these ways you need to not live immorally so that you can have a relative domestic stability in your family and in your household. And that these things go together. That God creates order on a divine level. The king then keeps that order on sort of the geopolitical level, and then you keep that order on a domestic level. And that all these things work together. And then when they don't work together, they all break together. Why is there a great flood in the story of Noah? Because moral failure has led to environmental failure. That in the same way that there are social mores and understandings of peaceability and getting along with each other and justice, as those things have broken down, in the same way the sky is breaking down and the waters are flooding down. And that the environmental and moral failures come together at the same time. And the Bible puts these things together all the time to say that that's how our world is. As I've been thinking about this, I think a lot about war and the things that war can and almost always does bring. The way that war is this breakdown of an international order and the ability of countries to get along with one another and peacefully coexist. And then what flows from that is a lot of dubious moral decisions. And we end up with war crimes and people being mistreated and individuals, losing their lives or losing limbs, people dying who are innocent bystanders. All these terrible moral things happen. And a bunch of environmental things happen, whether it's oil spills or burn pits that lead to all these carcinogens in the air. There's all these ways that that war is a great example of this connectedness, that the environment, that personal morality, and international order all breaks down and destroys, because those things go together. You can't do one without doing the other. And so I say all that to say that the Christian idea that I sometimes see, that like, oh, well, environmentalism isn't our concern. We're just kind of borrowing the planet. God will burn it up someday. It doesn't matter. It completely ignores the way the Bible talks holistically about our world. That we cannot be ambivalent about nature and then think that we won't be ambivalent about our neighbor and their lives, or ambivalent about sort of bigger international issues. They're all connected. People have noted that environmental changes that we've had and concerns about storms and hurricanes and tsunamis also tend to affect most people who are extremely poor. And so the environmental issue quickly becomes a justice issue. And as a Christian, we just can't live in a world that tries to divorce out those things. The Bible has this somewhat crazy idea to us that how I live morally, my ability to avoid robbery and to avoid murder and to avoid adultery, is connected to an international issue of peace and prosperity and global markets and all that stuff. And that is connected to environmental issues of our weather and earthquakes and all that kind of stuff. That all these things actually play into each other, and we can't divorce one from the other. The other really interesting thing I find here is this personification of nature. You guys know that I love C.S. Lewis and his literature, and particularly his fantasy. And Lewis and Tolkien, his friend as well, they often in their stories have living, speaking trees or have river spirits. And I think sometimes it will throw off some modern Christians. It feels a little new agey, but there's a reason for it. That Lewis saw some of these passages that talked about nature in a personified way and then copies that by having the spirits of the trees and the rivers and the land and the flowers interact with human characters. And the Bible does this interesting thing where nature is sometimes spoken of almost as if it's a person. And interestingly, it's usually a person that holds us accountable. We saw this a couple weeks ago when we read the story of Palm Sunday and Jesus enters into Jerusalem. And as he enters there, the Pharisees and the Sadducees don't like it. They say these people should not be hailing you as king. And Jesus says, let them. If they don't do it, the rocks will cry out. And Jesus, for a moment, plays with this fanciful idea, I don't know if that's a word, a fantasy idea, that the rocks have volition and thoughts, and that if we don't worship as we should, the rocks will do it for us. And this is in the Psalms as well, similar ideas of nature crying out in worship. And there's this idea that nature is holding us to account, that nature is seeing what we do, and that, frankly, it's going to act more appropriately than we will as human beings. And it's just an interesting idea. It's an interesting turn of phrase. It's an interesting way to think. I think all of it encourages us to see our world in a holistic way. That the way that you treat the poor person that you walk by on the street, and the way that you vote, and the things that you support, and the ways that you recycle or clean up your trash on your street, these things all are connected. And that a person of faith cannot say that one matters and the other doesn't, because they're integrated. And when one breaks down, they all break down, and the result can be catastrophe. It can be a flood. It can be the land getting so sick to its stomach of your misbehavior that it will vomit you out as a refugee. That's the way the Bible talks about these things and how they're integrated. So hopefully that's important, helpful for you as we come into the season talking a little bit about Earth Day and nature and all those kinds of things. We are about to take communion together here at the feast. We hope you do it at home. If you have some bread and juice or wine, I pray that you take it with whoever you're with. And be thankful that Jesus came as a reconciler. That Jesus came to reconcile us to one another, to help provide a path for nations to reconcile with each other, but even for us to reconcile with nature around us. Paul talks about how nature is groaning and desiring the full redemption that comes in Jesus Christ. And there's all these ways that the Bible will talk about how nature is being redeemed along with us. We could talk a lot more about these things. We could talk about the way our vision of heaven affects this. I will let you take your communion and enjoy it together. Enjoy your Sunday. If you want to go clean up your yard, clean up the neighborhood to be part of our service, we'd love for you to do that. Thanks for being with us. God bless. We'll talk to you soon.